Most people think they understand why narcissists abandon new supply. They believe it happens because the narcissist gets bored, finds someone better, or loses emotional interest once the novelty fades. That explanation feels satisfying because it keeps everything simple and external. Someone came along, something went wrong, and the narcissist moved on. But that story, while comforting, completely misses what is actually taking place beneath the surface. Narcissists do not leave because the new supply is inadequate. They leave because something far more destabilizing begins to happen inside their own psychological structure. To understand this, you have to let go of the idea that narcissistic relationships operate like normal emotional bonds. Narcissists do not attach in the way psychologically integrated people do. They do not gradually build intimacy, mutual recognition, or emotional depth. Instead, they rely on an external system to stabilize an inner absence. As long as that system works, they appear engaged, present, even invested. But the moment that system stops functioning properly, the relationship becomes intolerable to them, regardless of how attractive, loyal, or devoted the new supply may be. What most people never see is that the narcissist does not experience this moment as disappointment or heartbreak. There is no conscious realization that something is wrong with the relationship. Instead, there is a subtle but growing internal disturbance, a feeling that something is no longer holding together, a sense of exposure they cannot name. The new supply has not failed at being lovable. The new supply has failed at performing an unconscious psychological function the narcissist depends on to avoid confronting their own inner emptiness. This is where the framework of analytical psychology becomes essential. According to the work of Carl Jung, the human psyche is divided between what we consciously identify with and what we repress, disown, or refuse to acknowledge. That rejected material forms what Jung called the shadow. For psychologically healthy individuals, the shadow is difficult but negotiable. It can be reflected on, integrated, and gradually made conscious. For narcissists, however, the shadow is not merely uncomfortable, it is existentially threatening. Narcissism functions as a defense against the shadow. The grandiosity, the control, the charm, the superiority, all of it exists to prevent any direct encounter with inner deficiency, dependency, or shame. New supply is recruited into this defense system without ever being informed. Their role is not to be known or loved, but to mirror the narcissist's persona, regulate their emotions, and absorb disowned parts of the psyche through projection. As long as this mechanism runs smoothly, the narcissist experiences a sense of coherence and control. The problem begins when the new supply starts to behave like a real person rather than a psychological mirror. This shift is often quiet and invisible. It may look like emotional fatigue, subtle boundaries, reduced emotional labor, or a refusal to constantly affirm the narcissist's self-image. Sometimes it happens simply because time passes and the initial idealization wears thin. Whatever the trigger, the effect is the same. The mirror destabilizes. And when the mirror destabilizes, the shadow stirs. At this stage, the narcissist does not think, "This person is showing me something about myself." Instead, they experience a rising sense of discomfort, irritation, or unease that feels inexplicable. The relationship starts to feel heavy, draining, unsafe, not because of conflict, but because the new supply is no longer containing what the narcissist cannot face internally. The shadow begins to leak into awareness, not as insight, but as threat. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They assume the narcissist leaves because they stop caring. In reality, narcissists leave because staying would require a level of inner confrontation they are structurally unequipped to tolerate. To remain would mean acknowledging dependency, emptiness, or internal fragmentation. And narcissism, by design, cannot survive that acknowledgement. So the psyche does what it has always done when threatened. It retreats, resets, and seeks a new external stabilizer. The abandonment often feels sudden because it is not negotiated emotionally. There is no gradual processing or mutual understanding. One day the narcissist is present, the next they are distant, detached, or gone. What looks like cruelty from the outside is, from the inside, a form of psychological self-preservation. The narcissist is not choosing someone else over you. They are choosing to flee from an inner collapse they do not consciously understand. This is why trying to make sense of the abandonment at the level of behavior will always fail. There is no satisfying explanation that involves your worth, your effort, or your ability to love better. The rupture does not occur between two people. It occurs between the narcissist and their own shadow. And when that confrontation becomes unavoidable, the relationship becomes expendable. New supply is commonly misunderstood as a person. Someone new, someone different, someone temporarily exciting. But from a structural, psychological perspective, new supply is not a human being in the narcissist's inner world. It is a function, a role, a psychological instrument designed to stabilize something that cannot stabilize itself. When people ask why narcissists abandon new supply, they are already asking the wrong question, because they are still imagining a relationship between two individuals. What actually exists is a system. And the moment that system stops performing its function, it is discarded without negotiation. To understand this clearly, you have to separate attachment from dependency. Healthy attachment develops through mutual recognition, emotional reciprocity, and the gradual tolerance of imperfection. Dependency, in contrast, is functional. It is not about who the other person is, but about what they do for the internal balance of the self. Narcissists do not form attachment first and then become dependent. They form dependency immediately, and attachment is merely performed as a surface behavior to keep the system running. In this structure, new supply is unconsciously recruited to do several very specific things. First, they regulate emotional states. The narcissist cannot regulate alone. Anxiety, boredom, emptiness, insecurity, these are outsourced. Second, they mirror the narcissist's idealized self-image. They reflect back competence, desirability, importance, superiority. Third, they absorb disowned emotional material through projection. Doubt, weakness, neediness, shame. These qualities are not felt internally. They are located in the other person. As long as new supply performs these roles efficiently, the narcissist experiences a sense of internal coherence. This is why the early stage often feels intense, magnetic, even intimate. The narcissist appears focused, attentive, and emotionally invested. But what is being invested is not vulnerability or genuine interest. It is reliance. The narcissist is leaning on an external structure to hold together a fragile inner organization. New supply mistakes this intensity for connection because it looks and feels like being chosen. In reality, it is being installed. Crucially, this dynamic has nothing to do with the moral character, intelligence, or emotional capacity of the new supply. Highly empathetic, emotionally intelligent, self-aware individuals are often recruited precisely because they can perform these functions well, at least initially. Their attunement, patience, and emotional availability make them effective regulators. But this strength is also what eventually destabilizes the system, because real people cannot remain purely functional indefinitely. Over time, even the most accommodating new supply begins to respond from their own center. They feel tired. They hesitate. They want reciprocity. They introduce nuance, limits, or emotional truth. Sometimes this shift is dramatic, but more often it is subtle. A delayed response, a boundary that is not explained, a moment of emotional withdrawal. From the outside, these changes look minor. From the narcissist's internal perspective, they are seismic. The reason is simple, but rarely acknowledged. The narcissist does not experience these shifts as interpersonal changes. They experience them as structural failure. Something that was holding them together is no longer reliable. The mirror flickers. The emotional regulator lags. The projection no longer lands cleanly. And because the narcissist does not recognize the other person as separate from these functions, they cannot contextualize what is happening. They only know that the internal state they depend on is destabilizing. At this point, many people believe the narcissist should try harder, communicate, or repair the bond. But repair requires acknowledging that the other person exists as a subject with their own internal reality. In narcissistic structures, that acknowledgement is precisely what has been avoided from the beginning. To see the other as separate would mean recognizing dependency, limitation, and inner lack. So instead of repair, the psyche prepares for replacement. This is why narcissists can appear to move on so quickly and so cleanly. They are not ending a bond, they are decommissioning a function. New supply is not mourned in the way real attachment is mourned. There is no grief process, because nothing was internally integrated. What looks like emotional coldness is actually structural consistency. The system does exactly what it was designed to do when a component stops working. It removes it and searches for another. Understanding this is critical because it reframes the entire experience. Being abandoned by a narcissist does not mean you were unlovable, insufficient, or replaceable as a person. It means you stopped operating as a psychological function. And the moment you ceased to be a function, you became real. That is precisely the moment the narcissistic system can no longer sustain you within it. The moment new supply begins to fail is almost never dramatic. There is no obvious betrayal, no explosive argument, no clear turning point that announces itself. This is why most people misunderstand when the abandonment actually begins. They look for a visible rupture, but the real shift happens quietly, internally, long before any external change can be named. What collapses first is not the relationship, but the function the relationship was unconsciously designed to serve. From the narcissist's perspective, nothing happens at first. The new supply may still be present, responsive, and outwardly engaged. Conversations continue. Contact remains. On the surface, the bond looks intact, but internally something essential has stopped working. The emotional regulation that once flowed automatically now requires effort. The mirror that once reflected back certainty and superiority begins to blur. The sense of inner stability becomes inconsistent. The narcissist does not think this person has changed. They experience something far more unsettling. I no longer feel like myself. This is the true beginning of abandonment. Not the day they leave, but the moment the new supply stops buffering the narcissist from their own internal states. The narcissist is suddenly required to feel boredom without immediate relief, insecurity without instant reassurance, emptiness without distraction. These states are not processed as emotions. They are experienced as threats. Because for the narcissistic psyche, unregulated inner experience is not merely uncomfortable. It signals structural weakness. What triggers this failure can vary, but the pattern is remarkably consistent. Sometimes the new supply becomes less emotionally available, not out of malice, but exhaustion. Sometimes they introduce boundaries that limit access. Sometimes they stop over-explaining, over-reassuring, or over-functioning. Sometimes they simply mature emotionally and begin to respond rather than react. Even positive growth can destabilize the system because it reduces the narcissist's ability to externalize regulation. Crucially, the new supply does not need to confront the narcissist for this process to begin. Silence can trigger it. Neutrality can trigger it. Emotional self-containment can trigger it. Anything that reduces the narcissist's ability to offload internal tension activates the same internal alarm. From the outside, these behaviors look healthy and minimal. From the inside, they feel like abandonment before abandonment has even occurred. At this stage, the narcissist often becomes subtly dysregulated. They may grow irritable, restless, or withdrawn without knowing why. They may seek stimulation elsewhere, not necessarily another person, but anything that restores a sense of control. Work, attention, fantasy, or conflict can temporarily substitute for the failing function. But these are compensations, not solutions. The core problem remains. The new supply no longer performs the role they were unconsciously assigned. This is also the phase where many people believe they can fix things by giving more reassurance, more patience, more understanding. But this instinct misunderstands the nature of the collapse. The issue is not a shortage of supply. It is the activation of something the narcissist cannot tolerate. The more the new supply attempts to reinsert themselves as a stabilizer, the more they inadvertently highlight the narcissist's dependency. And dependency, once felt, becomes unbearable. The narcissist does not experience this as fear of loss. They experience it as loss of control. Control over their emotional state, their self-image, their internal coherence. The new supply, once a source of stability, now becomes a reminder that stability is not intrinsic. This realization does not enter consciousness as insight. It enters as irritation, contempt, or sudden disinterest. These reactions are not judgments of the other person. They are defenses against inner exposure. This is why the narcissist's behavior often shifts before they disengage. Devaluation may begin, not as punishment, but as psychological distancing. Emotional coldness increases. Criticism appears where admiration once existed. The narcissist is unconsciously attempting to reduce the impact of the failing mirror by dehumanizing it. If the new supply can be made smaller, weaker, or flawed, then the internal destabilization can be temporarily explained away. But this strategy only works briefly. The underlying issue is not the new supply's behavior. It is the narcissist's inability to sustain an inner self without constant external regulation. Once this becomes apparent at a felt level, the relationship enters a countdown phase. The narcissist may not know they are leaving yet, but the psyche has already marked the system as unreliable. Understanding this phase is critical because it explains why abandonment often feels abrupt to the one left behind. By the time the narcissist actually walks away, the internal withdrawal has already occurred. The emotional exit precedes the physical one. What looks sudden is simply the final step in a process that began the moment the new supply stopped functioning as an unconscious regulator. And this is the most unsettling truth. The new supply did not cause this collapse by doing something wrong. They caused it by becoming more real, more whole, or more self-contained. In a healthy relationship, that evolution deepens connection. In a narcissistic structure, it exposes the absence of an internal foundation. Once that exposure begins, abandonment is no longer a choice. It is the inevitable outcome of a system that cannot survive without illusion. What truly destabilizes the narcissist at this stage is not loss, rejection, or even abandonment. It is shadow activation. This is the moment when the psychological material that narcissism was designed to suppress begins to surface, not as insight, but as threat. The narcissist does not consciously recognize this process. They do not think in terms of inner conflict or repressed material. They simply experience a rising internal pressure that feels dangerous, overwhelming, and intolerable. In Jungian terms, the shadow contains everything the ego refuses to identify with. Dependency, inadequacy, emotional need, vulnerability, doubt, and shame all reside there. For most people, these elements are difficult but negotiable. They can be reflected upon, symbolized, and slowly integrated into a more complete self. Narcissism, however, is built on a different foundation. It is not organized around integration, but avoidance. The entire structure exists to ensure that these qualities never enter conscious awareness. New supply initially helps maintain this avoidance. Through idealization, admiration, and emotional availability, they keep the narcissist's attention oriented outward. The narcissist does not have to feel their own emptiness because someone else is constantly filling the space. They do not have to confront limitation because someone else is reinforcing superiority. But once the new supply stops functioning as a perfect external buffer, the avoided material begins to press upward. This is the point where narcissists experience something they cannot name but desperately want to escape. It is not sadness. It is not guilt. It is not longing. It is a sense of inner incoherence. A feeling that the self they rely on is thinning, cracking, or losing density. The narcissist may describe this state as irritation, boredom, or sudden disinterest. But these labels are defenses. What they are actually experiencing is proximity to their own shadow without the psychological capacity to hold it. Shadow activation is profoundly threatening to narcissists because it collapses the illusion of self-sufficiency. It exposes dependency. It reveals that their emotional equilibrium is not internal, but outsourced. For a psychologically integrated person, this realization might lead to reflection or growth. For a narcissist, it triggers panic at a structural level. Not panic as an emotion, but panic as a system response. This is why narcissists do not stay and work through this phase. There is no internal container for it. To remain in contact with a person who activates the shadow would require tolerating ambiguity, emotional discomfort, and self-questioning. These capacities develop through individuation, a process narcissistic structures never completed. Without this foundation, shadow material does not feel like information. It feels like annihilation. At this stage, the narcissist often begins to unconsciously associate the new supply with danger, not because the new supply has become abusive or harmful, but because their presence now coincides with inner destabilization. The psyche misattributes the source of distress. Instead of recognizing an internal deficit, the narcissist locates the problem externally. The new supply becomes too much, too demanding, too negative, or paradoxically, not enough. These contradictions are not logical judgments. They are symbolic defenses. Projection intensifies here. The narcissist may accuse the new supply of being needy, unstable, cold, or emotionally unavailable, the very qualities they cannot tolerate in themselves. By projecting shadow content outward, they temporarily relieve inner pressure, but projection alone is no longer sufficient. The mirror is too close, the activation too strong. Distance becomes necessary. This is the psychological origin of sudden withdrawal. The narcissist does not withdraw because they have evaluated the relationship and found it lacking. They withdraw because proximity now threatens the integrity of their defensive structure. The closer the new supply gets to seeing the narcissist as they are, rather than as they wish to appear, the more urgent the need to escape. It is important to understand that this is not a conscious strategy. Narcissists do not sit down and decide to abandon someone to protect their ego. The decision is made by the psyche long before the mind catches up. Behavior follows internal necessity, not reflective choice. The narcissist leaves because staying would force an encounter with parts of themselves they have spent a lifetime avoiding. This is also why attempts to reason with the narcissist at this stage fail completely. Explaining, reassuring, or offering understanding only deepens the threat. It keeps the connection alive. It maintains proximity, and proximity, at this point, equals danger. The only solution the psyche recognizes is removal. Shadow activation marks the point of no return. Once the new supply has triggered this process, the relationship cannot return to its earlier phase. The illusion has been disturbed. The narcissist may temporarily hover, idealize again, or oscillate between closeness and distance, but the internal verdict has already been reached. This source is no longer safe. And this reveals the most difficult truth of all. The narcissist does not abandon you because you failed to love them correctly. They abandon you because your presence made something real appear inside them, something they cannot integrate, something they cannot face, something that threatens the very structure they depend on to exist. At this point, a reasonable question emerges. If the narcissist senses that something is wrong, why don't they try to fix the new supply instead of abandoning it? Why not intensify control, deepen manipulation, or reassert dominance to restore the earlier dynamic? After all, narcissists are known for precisely these behaviors. The answer is not moral, emotional, or strategic. It is structural. Control no longer works once the problem is no longer external. In earlier phases, manipulation is effective because the issue lies at the level of behavior. The new supply can be pressured, shaped, reassured, or destabilized in ways that restore the narcissist's internal equilibrium. But once shadow activation has begun, the source of distress is no longer the other person's compliance. It is the narcissist's own exposed dependency. No amount of control over the external environment can fully suppress that realization once it has been felt. This is the critical turning point most people miss. Narcissists do not escalate manipulation indefinitely. They escalate it until it fails. When control ceases to regulate inner states, it becomes useless. Worse, it becomes dangerous. Every attempt to dominate or reshape the new supply now risks reinforcing the very truth the narcissist is trying to avoid, that their stability depends on someone else's internal participation. At this stage, even successful manipulation backfires. If the new supply submits, reassures, or complies, the relief is short-lived. The narcissist has already tasted the absence beneath the performance. The illusion no longer holds the same power. The system remembers its vulnerability, and memory, once formed, cannot be undone through repetition. If the new supply resists, sets firmer boundaries, or withdraws emotionally, the outcome is even clearer. The narcissist experiences this not as negotiation, but as exposure. Control attempts highlight separation. They reveal that the other person has an inner center that cannot be fully owned. This recognition intensifies shadow activation rather than containing it. This is why narcissists often appear to abruptly lose interest in controlling the new supply. From the outside, it looks like apathy or indifference. In reality, it is strategic withdrawal at the level of the psyche. Control requires engagement. Engagement requires proximity, and proximity has become unsafe. The narcissist does not stop controlling because they have matured. They stop because control now threatens the defensive structure instead of protecting it. Another common misunderstanding is the belief that narcissists leave because the new supply woke up or became too strong. While partially true, this explanation still centers the other person's behavior. The deeper truth is that the narcissist reaches a point where no version of the new supply can restore the original illusion. Even total submission would not resolve the internal breach. The problem is no longer relational. It is intrapsychic. This is also why narcissists often exit without explanation. Explaining would require self-reflection. Justifying would require coherence. Both demand an internal standpoint the narcissist does not possess in this moment. Silence is not cruelty. It is collapse avoidance. Distance becomes the only viable regulation strategy left. In many cases, this is where narcissists abruptly redirect attention elsewhere, not because the next source is better, but because novelty offers temporary insulation. A new face, a new story, a new reflection resets the system just enough to restore functioning. This is not healing. It is reconstitution. The same structure is rebuilt around a different mirror. What must be understood clearly is that abandonment at this stage is not evidence of victory or power. It is evidence of structural limitation. The narcissist leaves because they have exhausted their capacity to maintain the illusion in this specific relational context. Walking away is not an assertion of superiority. It is an admission unconscious, but absolute, that the system cannot survive further exposure. This is why trying to provoke closure, accountability, or emotional recognition from the narcissist after abandonment is futile. There is nothing to negotiate. The exit was not chosen through dialogue. It was executed by a psyche reaching the edge of its tolerance. Any attempt to re-engage risks being misinterpreted as threat or invitation to reset the illusion again. Understanding this reframes the entire experience. The narcissist did not choose to stop fighting for the relationship because it lacked value. They stopped because fighting would have required confronting an internal truth that could not be integrated. Abandonment, in this sense, is not a strategy. It is the final defense of a structure that cannot evolve. What follows abandonment is often misunderstood as freedom or victory on the narcissist's part. From the outside, it can look decisive, empowered, even superior. They left. They moved on. They found someone else. But this interpretation mistakes motion for resolution. What actually occurs after the narcissist walks away is not emotional relief, but functional collapse disguised as momentum. The narcissist does not leave carrying clarity. They leave carrying fragmentation. The system that once relied on a specific external stabilizer has been disrupted, and while a new configuration may temporarily restore surface functioning, nothing fundamental has changed. The same dependency remains. The same avoidance persists. The same shadow remains unintegrated. The only difference is that the mirror has been replaced. This is why narcissists often appear emotionally flat or strangely hollow after abandonment. There is no true processing of loss because there was no internalized bond to grieve. Grief requires attachment. Attachment requires recognition of the other as a separate subject. In narcissistic structures, that recognition never fully occurred. What is experienced instead is a dull absence, an echo where regulation once existed. Over time, this absence demands compensation. The narcissist may intensify their search for stimulation, admiration, or validation. They may repeat the same relational patterns with new people, convinced each time that this connection will be different. But repetition is not renewal. It is confirmation that the structure has not evolved. Each cycle reinforces the same conclusion without ever making it conscious. Something essential inside remains missing. This is the deeper tragedy of narcissistic abandonment. The narcissist does not leave to grow. They leave to preserve stasis. Movement replaces transformation. Change is simulated through novelty, not achieved through integration. From the outside, it looks like progression. From the inside, it is entrenchment. For the person who was abandoned, this phase often triggers confusion. The narcissist seems unaffected, detached, untouched. This can feel invalidating, even cruel. But the absence of visible pain is not evidence of strength. It is evidence of disconnection. What was lost was not processed because it was never fully held. And this leads to the most important reframe of all. The abandonment was not a judgment of your value. It was a limit of their structure. You were not left because you were replaceable. You were left because you became irreplaceable in the only way that mattered. You stopped functioning as an illusion. The question that begins this video, why narcissists suddenly abandon new supply, cannot be answered at the level of behavior, preference, or emotion. It can only be answered at the level of structure. Narcissists do not leave because someone better appears. They leave because the psychological system that kept them intact can no longer operate in the presence of someone real. New supply fails not by doing something wrong, but by becoming whole, by developing boundaries, by withdrawing unconscious emotional labor, by no longer acting as a mirror without depth. In a healthy relationship, these shifts create intimacy. In a narcissistic structure, they activate collapse. Once this process begins, abandonment is not a choice. It is an inevitability. The narcissist cannot stay without confronting the shadow. They cannot confront the shadow without dismantling the defenses that define them. And so they do what the structure has always done when threatened. They leave. Understanding this changes everything. It removes self-blame. It dissolves the fantasy that you could have fixed it by loving harder or giving more. It reveals that what ended was not a relationship between two equal selves, but a system that required your disappearance as a person to survive. The most important shift, then, is not understanding the narcissist. It is understanding what you were asked to sacrifice to remain. Your emotional center, your autonomy, your reality. When that sacrifice ended, so did the system. And this is the final truth. When you stop being a function, you become a threat to narcissism, but you also become yourself again. What they walked away from was not you. It was the moment you could no longer disappear inside their illusion.